am Harshila Purohit, and together we are going to study paper 5 of your CS professional program called Corporate Restructuring, Insolvency, Liquidation and Winding Up. Now, I think the name itself makes it pretty obvious that the topic is a pretty complicated and a long one, which is why if you have looked at the modules that have been provided by ICSI, you must have noticed that the entire subject has been split up into two parts, part 1 and part 2. Part 1 contains all of the topics that are kind of related to corporate restructuring and which kind of go together and make sense as a complete unit. And the part 2 contains all of the topics related to insolvency, liquidation and winding up. In this lecture, what we're basically going to do is, we're not going to start studying right away. First, we're going to get an overview of the entire pattern, the exam pattern. Basically, we'll take a look at how the paper by ICSI is given to you, what exactly is the structure of the paper. Then we are going to take a look at the chapter-wise weightage, the kind of, what kind of marks you can expect from each chapter in the examination. And then we are going to take a look, a basic overview of all of the chapters that are within this subject. Okay, so let's start with the paper pattern. The general paper pattern and marking scheme is as follows. The paper is also split up into two parts, just like your modules. So part 1 is 50 marks and part 2 is 50 marks. Part 1 contains, the first question is always, I think you may know by CS executive papers only, that question 1 is always the compulsory question. So your question 1 is of 20 marks, which is split up into 4 parts, 1A, 1B, 1C, 1D, each being allotted 5 marks by itself. Then in question 2, you have an option of being able to solve either question 2 or question 2A, depending upon what you think you're most skilled at, what you think that you can write better answers for. So question 2 has been split up into 3 parts again, A, B, C, each question being of 5 marks. And then 2A also obviously is of same pattern. Now question 3 again of 15 marks, which has been split up into 5 parts, each question being of 3 marks. Okay, so you have 3A, 3B, 3C, 3D, 3E, each being allotted 3 marks by ICSI. Now here part 1 ends, basically 20 marks plus 15 plus 15, 50 marks. So question 1, question 2 and question 3 together are allotted to part 1 of your entire subject, and then 4, 5, 6 have been allotted to part 2 of your entire subject. Question 4 again compulsory question, the same pattern as in question 1, one question split up into 4 parts, each question being 5 marks. So in totality 20 marks. Again question 5, you don't have an option in question 5 here. Again, I will just clarify that this is a general pattern. It may change. You generally do have an option in at least 2 questions, but it may or may not be question 5 or question 6. So that is up to ICSI, but generally this is the paper that is, paper pattern that is followed. Now question 5 has been split up into 5 parts, each question being 3 marks. And obviously this amounts to 15 marks of your paper. And then in question 6, you have an option of either going with question 6 or question 6A. Question 6 or question 6A, whatever it is, has been split up into 3 marks, 5 marks being allotted to each question. Again, you can see 20 plus 15 plus 15, 50 marks. So this is how your paper has been planned out. And I think you can see that there are a lot of questions that you need to solve. And because of the fact that this subject particularly contains so many topics, it becomes a little bit hard to kind of make it concise while writing your answers. So while studying, you also have to focus on the fact that all of the topics that you're studying in this subject have to be written by you in a concise manner in the paper. Okay, so that is why note making is a really important process, but we'll talk about that more in lecture 1. So this is your general paper pattern. Now let's go to the chapter wise weightage. The first chapter, this is I'm not going to demarcate on the basis of part 1 and part 2 in this part at least, but yeah, this is generally the amount of marks that are allotted. Again, up to ICSI to change it. If you can see any of these marks in detail, you can notice that there are some chapters which have been allotted a lot of marks in some years and then none at all in later years. So that is up to ICSI. It the institute may surprise you. They may want to take a step to surprise the students. They may want to catch you off guard. So kind of be prepared for that fact that there are certain unforeseeable factors while giving an examination of this level, right? So types of corporate restructuring, I think at an average, we'll just take a look at the average marks. This has been averaged out on the basis of June 17 attempt to June 22 attempt. Okay, so 13, 16, 16, 13, around that. So you get around 13.3 marks. So basically out of the 100 100 mark paper, around 13.3 marks are allotted to corporate restructuring. Now this may vary also because of the options that are given to you. So don't take that, they take this prima facie as that 13.3 marks is definitely going to be asked from this paper. There may be a possibility that around 8 marks of these are from optional questions. Okay, acquisition of company, business planning and strategy, 10, 4.8, 8.7. Then there are some chapters that don't have that much weightage, like documentation. But that is because this chapter is particularly a derivation of all of the chapters that you have studied above this. Valuation of business and assets for corporate restructuring, one of my personal favorite chapters. So you can see that there are some years in which 35 marks paper has been asked from this chapter alone, and then this is the December 20 attempt in which only 5 marks have been allotted to this chapter. So yeah, institute likes to play with you a little. Accounting and corporate restructuring, again, I think at an average 5.4 marks. Taxation and stamp duty aspects of corporate restructuring, average 3.3. But again, there are some attempts in which a lot of marks have been allotted to this particular chapter. Competition Act, around 5.2, because you first of all, you have already studied Competition Act in your executive. So if there are topics that have been repeated in CS professional, meaning that there are topics that you have already studied in CS executive, there might be a chance that not as many marks have been allotted to that particular chapter as have been allotted to other chapters, right? Regulatory approvals of scheme, appearance before NCLT, 1.5, 3.5, 2.3, 2.9, and then you can see the entire paper pattern for all of the questions. Now, I particularly don't design my studies too much, I don't give too much weightage to the chapter wise weightage, basically, because as I said, the institute may want to surprise you, but this is just for your reference. You might be curious, you might want to have an idea of what chapters you can kind of work harder on, and what chapters you mandatorily need to study. For example, valuation of business and assets for corporate restructuring, a pretty heavy chapter, because basically every attempt has definitely asked at least one question on this chapter. So these chapters are basically the ones that you have to mandatorily study no matter what. But then there are chapters like documentation. So you can see that not as many marks have been allotted to that chapter. But as we study, as we move along, you'll notice that my particular strategy when I'm studying for any examination is to complete all of the chapters. Right? The optional part is for maybe because you get a very less time for revision if you're giving all of the 3 modules together, especially, so you don't get a lot of time for revision. So those are the chapters in which, for example, if I have only 6 hours to revise for my entire examination, documentation may be a chapter that I maybe won't revise, right? So those are the chapters that I keep for, maybe these are not mandatory to be revised also. So those are the chapters that I keep for that purpose. Okay, but if you ask, can we leave this chapter entirely? I don't recommend that. Absolutely not, because I really do think that all of these chapters combine together to form a kind of understanding in your mind related to that topic. Okay, so this is just for your reference. Now we'll take a look at the chapters that you have and basically get an overview of how to make this subject cohesive, because as we've noticed, it has kind of a lot of chapters, varied topics, so we have to form some kind of cohesion so that it makes sense in your mind, right? So part 1 contains types of corporate restructuring. What exactly is corporate restructuring, we'll obviously study in detail in the upcoming lectures, but basically it means the way that a company can transform in different formations, inorganically. So what exactly that means, that is something that we'll study in later chapters. But I think you must have heard compromises, arrangement and schemes rules in CS Executive Company Law program. So hint, this is something about that only. Second, acquisition of company and business, again something that you've read in CS Executive. The takeover regulations you must have read in the SLCM chapter, Securities Laws and Capital Markets, subject. So in that you must have read SAS regulations, right? So the acquisition and takeover regulations are something that is applied here in chapter 2. As we go ahead, you'll notice a pattern that CS professional studies are kind of an extension of everything you've studied in CS Executive only. So every chapter that you see here, there won't be too many topics about which you haven't heard anything at all before this chapter, before this lecture. Okay, you must have at least a little bit of hint of what is being talked about in that chapter. So that is because almost all of these topics are nothing but an extension of what you've studied in CS Executive. Okay, people who've had a long break between CS Executive and CS Professional may struggle a little bit because of this fact, right? Then planning and strategy, which contains all of the information related to how exactly is a company is supposed to merge or acquire or amalgamate, all of these things, what factors did they need to consider while doing such schemes, while entering into these arrangements. All of this has been laid out in planning and strategy. Next, process of mergers and amalgamation. So this is basically the procedural aspect related to mergers and amalgamation. I think it makes it pretty clear. So what you learn in this particular chapter is key concepts of M&A, law and procedure, the due diligence part related to M&A transactions, then documentation, merger and amalgamation. Now, when we were talking about the chapter wise weightage, I've already mentioned in that segment that this chapter is kind of an extension of all of these chapters. This is because when you are studying the process of an M&A transactions, you're already familiarizing yourself with all of the documents that are needed for these transactions to be able to take place, right? So that is why this is kind of an extension of this chapter only. Next, valuation of business and assets for corporate restructuring, something that a lot of students struggle with, something that is personally one of my favorite chapters in this entire subject, because I really do like finance a lot. So this chapter is basically related to, while you're entering into these schemes, these mergers, these amalgamations, if I am thinking of acquiring a different company, then I must value it at the right price so I don't overpay, right? Or if I'm a company that is being acquired by another company, I must make sure that I get a fair share of the deal, right? So this is all related to valuation of business and assets for corporate restructuring. It basically means how you are going to value. It talks about the methodologies that are used to value these businesses and assets right before these schemes or these arrangements are done or entered into, right? Next, accounting in corporate restructuring. Obviously, I think you all might be familiar with accounting standards at this point. So accounting standards kind of guide us on how we are supposed to do the accounting for different kind of transactions. So this 7th chapter is talking about how we are going to do accounting for corporate restructuring. Obviously, a little bit of a difficult topic if we go into the practical aspect, but this chapter thankfully only focuses on the theoretical aspect. So it just talks about 2 different options that you may have for accounting treatments. Next, you have taxation and stamp duty aspects of corporate restructuring. At this point, you may feel like the last 3 chapters have more to do with accountancy than law, but that's not true. as a as a company secretary, you have to be aware of how things are being valued. You have to at least have enough information related to all of these topics so that you know whether something is being done rightly or in incorrect manner, right? So that is why you also take a look at the taxation and stamp duty aspects, so that you can ensure that a company has been doing everything correctly, that it is compliant with all of the laws. So this talks about the different kind of taxation aspects of different kind of mergers, amalgamation schemes, what have you. Next, Competition Act. If anybody has already guessed why Competition Act is in this particular segment, kudos to you. But yes, if you have guessed it, you might have guessed it correctly. It's because Competition Act is nothing but, as we have studied in EBCL in CS Executive, it talks about how business combinations aren't supposed to create monopolies in the market, right? So as we have talked about different kind of mergers and amalgamations in all of the above chapters, obviously we have to study whether these kind of different business combinations have any kind of appreciable adverse effect on the market, right? The words have been taken exactly from Competition Act by me, but that was an accident. Yeah, so Competition Act is necessary to again understand what are the legal aspects related to competition law in business combinations or schemes. But even though this is a long chapter, and even though this is a technical and legal chapter, because of the fact that we have already studied it in CS Executive, you might have noticed that not a lot of marks have been allotted to this chapter, but I do think it is very necessary. The regulatory approvals of scheme. So this talks about, obviously you're not going to, again you can see here CCI has been mentioned here as well. Different kind of regulatory authorities need to give their approval when you're entering into these different kind of business combinations. So this is talking about that only. Appearance before NCLT or NCLAT. As a CS professional, and during this entire procedure, you might have to appear before NCLT or NCLAT, as the case may be. And this chapter basically talks about how that process is done, how you have to present yourself as a company secretary, and the related aspects of it. Then you have fast track mergers, and then cross border mergers. Very interesting topics. Fast track mergers is nothing but small companies and small businesses have been allowed to enter into mergers and amalgamations in a slightly easier and quicker manner. And then cross-border mergers, I think the name again makes it pretty obvious what it's talking about, but it's talking about when maybe one of the businesses that are the part of the scheme or arrangement is maybe not a domestic company. Let's take a look. Yeah, so first of all, let's just understand how all of these topics are going together. All of these topics are nothing but an amalgamation or a combination of all the things that are required to be known by you while checking the corporate or the legal aspect of corporate restructuring done by different businesses. So all of these topics combine together to basically talk about corporate restructuring in India. Now, let's move on to the second part. The second part is insolvency, liquidation and winding up, again having 50 marks. And this is kind of up to you if you find this topic interesting or not. But obviously, we'll try our best in these lectures itself to make it one of the most interesting topics, But the good part about this topic is that everything goes together. It's kind of like, it forms a circular pattern in your mind of all of the things that are required to be done while doing insolvency, liquidation or winding up, whatever the case may be. The bad part is that because it is so linked together individually and together, you may have a problem with leaving out chapters in this one. Okay, so you can't just leave out chapters, because then what happens in a chain? If one link is broken, the entire chain is broken, right? So you have to pay attention to that in at least part 2. So lesson 14, insolvency. I think we might have studied a little bit in CS Executive what is the difference between insolvency, liquidation and winding up, but we are going to revise that a little bit in this chapter as well. Then we'll see petition for corporate insolvency resolution process. So this is a phrase that we are going to be becoming very familiar with, CIRP, or corporate insolvency resolution process. This basically talks about how a company or how a business can, file for insolvency, or how other parties can file for insolvency of another business. Interesting topic. We'll come back to it in the upcoming lectures. Then role, functions and duties of IP, IRP or RP. That is something that you will understand after we have learned the above two chapters. Resolution strategies, convening and conduct of meetings of committee of creditors. Again, something that you'll see what I said about all of these chapters being linked together. You can't even exactly understand the main chapter name without knowing the contents of the above chapters, right? Preparation and approval of resolution plan. Then individual or firm, all of this talks about different kinds of insolvency of different organizations. So this chapter talks about what happens when an individual or a firm wants to is conducting the process of insolvency. Then fresh start process, again something that we'll talk about in later chapters. Debt recovery and SURFASI, something that you have learned a little bit in CS Executive, SURFASI at least. This basically talks about how banks can recover from defaulters. Okay. Then cross-border insolvency. Again, cross-border implies that we are going to talk about something international in this chapter. Liquidation on or after failing of resolution plan. This is the chapter related to liquidation. And then voluntary liquidation. And then winding up by tribunal. When winding up by tribunal is done is also mentioned in CS Executive Company Law, if you remember correctly. And then voluntary liquidation is obviously talking about when a company is wanting to liquidate itself voluntarily. So this is kind of, and then lesson 27, pre-packaged insolvency resolution process. Again, something that we'll talk about in later chapters only. Not a lot of questions have been asked from this particular chapter, but it is definitely a part of your syllabus and we'll study it in upcoming lectures. So this, I think, makes it very clear about what we can expect in the upcoming lectures, what you have to work on, what you may have to be prepared for in the upcoming lectures. And I think a little bit of a strategy has been started to form in your minds related to how you're going to approach the subject. So we'll start with chapter 1 in our next lecture. See you then.